Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Corbin, Kentucky, 1930. The Great Depression. Big Matt Stewart owns a gas station on a strip of highway so dangerous that it's known as Hell's Quarter Mile. It's the last stop for food and gas along a long and lonesome highway, but it's also home to a lot of tough characters. Stewart's biggest competition is a nearby Shell service station, known not only for competitively priced gas, but also for having an attached cafe that has been serving up apparently some of the best fried chicken in the state. The Sanders Court and Cafe painted a huge sign at the entrance of town, directing people to the location. This doesn't work for Matt Stewart. It's cutting into his profits. So he came out at night and painted over the sign. A few days later, it was back. So Stewart came out once again, this time with a crew of his toughest guys. They got to work, painting over that damn fried chicken sign once again. Only this time, before they were finished, there was the sound of cars pulling into the lot nearby. It was the owner of the rival station, Harland Sanders, and he's got a crew with him. They're all armed. Matt Stewart looks at his guys. He nods. They draw their weapons as well. There is about to be a showdown on Hell's Quarter Mile. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am joined today by a very special guest. He is a producer, writer, director. He's been working for 19 years in various nonfiction genres, spanning true crime, comedy, docuseries. He's been on CBS, Discovery, History, Bravo, MTV. I want to welcome Jason Cavanagh to Badass of the Week. Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jason, you have been working in Hollywood for a while. Your resume is very impressive looking through it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And so it's really, we're really happy to have you on the show. When you first agreed to come on, we were excited to have you be here to talk to us. And, our producer who connected us was like, oh, Jason's going to come on. It's going to be great. I said, oh, yeah, well, I loved Son of a Hitman. I loved, some of the other programs you've worked on. You've done some cool true crime stuff. I'm like, oh, maybe we'll get some mafia stuff. Maybe we'll get some true crime stuff. But the suggestion that you had to talk about on the show was not one that I was expecting.
Yeah. So earlier this year, I was working on a series called The Food That Built America, and a spinoff called The Mega Brands That Built America. But, Andrew and I saw each other a week or so ago for lunch. And, he mentioned he was doing the show, and he said, would you want to come on as a guest? And do you have any, potential stories that you've covered over the years? Somebody who you think might be like a great badass to feature on the show. And I was like, you know what? I've got just the guy. And, we did an episode of The Food That Built America. And it was about Colonel Sanders, Mm-hmm. And the Colonel, he lived a really colorful life. The guy, in more ways than one, I would say he is a badass. I think he meets the criteria.
Yeah. When you said that you were going to come on and talk about Colonel Sanders, there's one story that we might mention later that I had heard before. I know that he's like a playable character as in one of the wrestling games on PS3. I think there was a comic book where he fought Gorilla Grodd. And so I know of him, but I was really curious when you said that. I knowing nothing else, I was like, yeah, let's do it. I don't know anything about this, but I'm into it. Let's hear about how badass Colonel Sanders is. And I was very pleasantly surprised when I started getting into my research on him because, wow, what an interesting guy.
I think we'll have done our jobs here if Colonel Sanders becomes a Fortnite skin. I think we'll know we've really elevated him up to that badass status once and for all. That's right.
If Norm Macdonald couldn't do it, then maybe you and me can. Okay, so we figured, we've got Thanksgiving coming up on Thursday, so why not just kind of go all in for a Thanksgiving badass. We are going to talk about Colonel Harlan Sanders. We have to take a really quick commercial break. And then when we're back, we're going to find out what makes the Colonel a real life certifiable badass. So stay with us. All right, welcome back to the show. I am here with writer and producer Jason Cavanagh. And Jason, we're going to talk about Colonel Sanders. So where do we begin here?
Well, I just, as a little lead into Colonel Sanders, he was a hustler. He's a fighter. In some ways, he's the original influencer.
Yeah.
An expert at branding. He's kind of like the Steve Jobs of fried chicken. Instead of the black turtleneck, he had the southern bow tie. Not a bolo tie, by the way. It's a southern bow tie.
Okay, that's an important distinction, I imagine. Yeah,
it is. I was calling it a bow tie for a minute there, and then I realized no, the bolo tie is just the two strings. This is a string tie or a southern bow tie. It's a bow tie with like the two long parts hanging down.
Okay.
But right, he wore the bow tie, the white suit, the gold tip cane.
He had the gold cane. I forgot about that. He did have a gold tip cane.
Like the guy branded himself before we knew what an influencer was, before we knew the power of branding to that degree. There were brand mascots prior to Colonel Sanders. There's Mr. Peanut, there's Aunt Jemima, but Colonel Sanders was a real person.
Right.
This was an actual guy. He was actually Colonel Harlan Sanders, before he was the face on everybody's bucket of chicken. This guy, I think he's ahead of his time. I think he's a badass. So, but to get into it, let's just start from his childhood. He's born in 1890 in Henryville, Indiana. He's raised by his mom. His father passed away when he was 5 years old. And he drops out of school at the age of 12 to take care of his siblings. He's working as a farmhand, and it's during this time that he learns how to cook. They're not well off, and so he learns to cook for his siblings.
Kind of take care of his family and that kind of thing too, right? Because his mom is doing the full-time working thing, and this is going to be a theme for Colonel Sanders, where he's going to just have like a billion jobs, right?
Yes, yes, and that's where I say like this guy's a hustler. Like here's somebody who was born into the struggle, and he was not going to be kept down.
Yeah, he's going to have a million jobs, and then the KFC stuff is like way later in his life. Like I was not prepared for how old he was when KFC actually starts to take off. Like
there's hope for all of us.
Yeah, he'd been kind of grinding. He's not one of these Mozarts or Alexander the Greats who were like kind of live fast, burn out, like accomplish all this stuff. But by 30, he grinded for decades before this ended up working out for him.
Yeah. So at 16, he lies about his age and he enlists in the army. And just a year later, he's honorably discharged. I'm assuming they found out he was not old enough to be there. Just kind of them to give him an honorable discharge.
Yeah. He goes to Cuba, right, as part of the army service. Because like you hear the colonel, you think, oh, honestly, from the way he dresses and stuff, you'd think he was like a Civil War colonel. But like, when you hear the colonel, you think, oh, maybe he's a veteran. He was a veteran. He had 1 year. He got a Cuba Pacification Medal for being part of the American occupation of Cuba following the Spanish-American War. But he never became an officer or an NCO or anything. He was there for 1 year, underage, and he was discharged.
Yes, although the title of colonel, he did earn it, but we'll get there.
Right.
But not a colonel in the army.
Yes.
He comes back home. He starts working as a railroad laborer, gets fired for fighting. Then he starts studying law. Again, he gets into a fight in the courtroom. End of his hopes of being a lawyer.
He gets a law degree. He gets a law degree by mail, right, while he's shoveling coal in a steam engine, and then he gets the law degree. He leaves his family in one place to go to, I think, Little Rock to practice law, and then literally gets into a fist fight with his client in the courtroom.
This is not a man you disagree with.
Yeah. He beat up a coworker on the railroad, and then he beat up his client when he was a lawyer, which is just in the courtroom in front of the judge. It's really hard to find work as a lawyer after that. I'll fight for you and with you and against you.
Which is fitting that he's then in a wrestling video game.
Right. Yeah. He probably
posthumously.
Right. Chicken nugget tombstone pile driver. He'd been perfecting that since the early 1900s.
So he moves back in with his mom, starts selling life insurance. Once again, fired for insubordination. So, a fiery character, not the kindly old grandpa that we now know and love.
Yeah.
He bounces around for a number of years. At the age of 30, he tries his luck at the ferry boat business, which is sort of fitting. He has like a Mark Twain kind of a vibe about him. I don't know if that's where he gets the persona. He finds out he doesn't love this work. He tries cashing in on the ferry business for a lamp manufacturing company. But unfortunately, he finds out there's a competitor who makes a better lamp. So he gives up on it. Hey, we all got to try different things before we find our true calling. And again, this gives me hope. We can all find our way. It's a journey.
Yeah, because he's in like his 30s or 40s at this point in the story, right? Like, he's been
30 years old. Yeah,
he's been getting into fights. He's been getting in trouble. This is like finding out that like your kind old grandpa like got a silver star for like killing a bunch of guys in a war. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So he was kind of like this hot-headed, like, always kind of grinding for cash, grinding to, and not just because he was like just to keep himself and his family alive, right? He was just kind of scraping by, literally like scraping coal residue out of old like steam engines and stuff after they got done with their trips. It's wild stuff. And now, this lamp thing doesn't work out for him either.
Then in 1924, at the age of 34 years old, he has what I would say is like his first stroke of good fortune. He's out hitchhiking, as one does, and he gets a ride from a guy who works for Standard Oil. They get to talking, and the guy offers Sanders a job managing a rural gas station, which... Amazing. Listen, if you're unemployed and you're out hitchhiking and you manage to get a guy from Standard Oil to give you a gas station to run, you have a silver tongue. I gotta hand it to the guy. He's gifted. Despite the fighting, despite the temper, like he clearly knows how to hustle. He knows how to work a room, work a car, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just it's like the Depression kind of time period, right? Or maybe a little earlier.
Yeah.
Just hitchhiking. This guy gave me a gas station.
Amazing. The Depression then hits actually while he's managing the gas station.
Oh,
and unfortunately, right. And within a couple years, they have to close the place down. But the people at Standard Oil, they like the way he moved. So they're like, you know what, we're going to give you another gas station to manage rent-free. And it's going to be in Corbin, Kentucky, in an area of Corbin, Kentucky known as Hell's Half Acre. And
sounds like prime real estate.
This is right. I think this is why they're like, you know what, we're going to let you manage this gas station rent-free. It's literally in hell.
Bear with us. It's called Hell's Half Acre, but...
And this area is known as Hell's Half Acre because it's extremely dangerous. It's an area known for bootlegging, gunfights, crime. That being said, you're dealing with Harlan Sanders here, who is a guy who, likes to fight, has been fighting his whole life. He's like, oh, hell yeah, Hell's Half Acre. That's my place. He will thrive here.
Hopefully nobody will mess with me and require me to beat them up in front of my customers.
Well,
oh no.
Well, we'll get there. So it's in this gas station in Hell's Half Acre that he begins, to supplement his income selling gas. He begins frying up chicken in the back of this gas station and selling it to road-weary travelers.
That's it. KFC starts at a gas station in Hell's Half Acre. A gas station in hell.
He starts serving up this chicken. It's crispy, You make chicken in hell, it gets crispy. But his gas station in 1929, the gas station's becoming, it's gaining popularity. There's word of mouth. This guy's serving chicken out of here. It's pretty good.
You got to drive through all the gunfights, but the chicken's really good. And that sounds like some neighborhoods near where I live too, though.
100%. It's like, listen, the barbecue's fantastic. It's a little dicey, but that's where you get some of our best restaurants come out of.
Just go during the day.
The rent's cheap. So he paints advertisements for his gas station and his fried chicken on the side of barns, locally. And because he's drawing all this attention, he also draws attention from a local rival gas station owner who doesn't like the fact that Sanders is getting all this attention for his chicken, for his gas station, blah, blah, blah. And the rival and his cronies go out and start painting over Harlan Sanders' roadside ads. So
I get the feeling that this is not going to go well for that guy.
So, listen, Harlan Sanders is not one to back down, as we've learned. So he gathers up a few of his buddies and they go out there to confront this rival and his guys while they're painting over one of these signs.
This is like Anchorman.
And as we know, he loves lamp.
Yeah, he loves lamp.
The lamp factory didn't work out for him, but he does love lamp.
But he did get a posse of guys together to have a fried chicken war with the rival fried chicken producer.
Well, this isn't even a fried chicken producer. This is just a gas station owner.
Okay.
This guy just owns a gas station, but he's coming at him, painting over his ads. So they go out there,
demands a response.
These guys. They confront these guys, and again, we're in Hell's Half Acre, and a gunfight ensues.
Oh my God.
Gunfight ensues. One of Sanders' men is shot and killed.
Wow.
Sanders retaliates and he shoots the rival gas station owner, injures him, but does not kill him. Ultimately, the rival gets charged. Sanders gets off scot-free, and he's managed to eliminate his rival, which
with gunfire.
Through gunfire. So it's pretty badass. I'm not condoning violence or gunfighting over fried chicken or gas stations, but
you don't need that disclaimer with this podcast. We always assume that nobody's going to go out and act on these things. We're not
okay. Don't shoot your rivals, but I think it's pretty badass in Depression era. Gas station fried chicken owner, you get in a gunfight in Hell's Half Acre and you win.
Yeah, you get in there. I mean, this is what, like, Dillinger time period, right? Like Tommy gun. I'm picturing Tommy guns and 45s and stuff.
You get off scot-free too.
He didn't do anything wrong. He showed up. That guy was painting over his stuff. We're like, well, maybe that dude should have been painting over his stuff. He didn't get shot in Hell's Half Acre.
Right. Unfortunately, his friend does get killed. But
that is a tragedy.
It's part of it.
I mean, that's part of signing up for a gunfight, I imagine.
That's right. This is just part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So now he avoids legal repercussions. His rival's eliminated. He can really, he's established at this point, do not mess with me or my gas station or my fried chicken. And he can focus on serving delicious soul food. Now, at the time, chicken is actually not a popular dish nationwide. It's gaining in popularity, but like previously, chicken is eaten, it's honestly, it's known as yard bird. It's basically for people who, can't necessarily afford livestock, beef, pork.
Yeah, that's still a thing in some countries. My wife's family is from Brazil, and in Brazil, they don't eat a lot of chicken. It's like, well, if you can afford red meat, you put that on the table, and otherwise you eat chicken. So it's like not a common dish, there either. So I feel like this was kind of the vibe here at this time as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just saw a chart for chicken consumption in the U.S., and it's been on a steady rise. From this time period to today, it's continuing to rise in terms of chicken consumption per capita, whereas every other meat is either on a flat line or declining. And it's just an interesting thing to think there was a time when people just did not consider chicken to be something that you would seek out necessarily.
Until
until Colonel Sanders comes along. Well, and in fact, like it's with the advancements in the commercial incubator, chicken just becomes more widespread.
Oh,
Part
right,
of it
because it
is
doesn't go
just
bad. You got to transport it, and it goes bad so
exactly,
easily.
and just to be able to literally hatch, the number of chickens you need to feed, this massive country. So, Colonel Sanders, or Harlan Sanders, he's not yet the colonel. He grew up eating chicken partially because he was poor. He was really poor, raised by a single mom who works in a factory. And now
And she was
he's
gone for like days at a time. That was the wild thing when I
yeah.
was looking through that. When she was gone, she was working at like a canning factory, but like she would leave
Mhm.
home and go there and like sleep at the factory and come back like days later. And so he's like, what, 12 or something. And he's taking care of his entire family, which he had a couple of brothers and sisters, I think. And he was kind of 12 years old and running his house for multiple days at a time while his mom was off. I mean, and this is whatever, 1905. So she's probably making like 12 cents a day or whatever, just pretty wild. But yeah, but he was doing a lot of the cooking for the family then too, and that's kind of where some of this comes from, right?
Yeah, so he's scrappy, and now similarly in the 30s, he's taking this dish that he ate as a child. It's becoming more popular, and he's experimenting with the recipe. He recognizes that he needs to make larger portions in a shorter amount of time because you have travelers coming through. It's literally a gas station. So you have people stopping in. They don't necessarily want to wait for him to pan fry pieces of chicken.
Yeah. And the gas station was 24 hours a day too. It looked like I was looking at one of these reviews that somebody had left him and they said, yeah, it was a 24-hour service. So
yeah, so right. So this is like, you want to be able to make larger quantities of this chicken faster. And so he starts tinkering with what at the time is a lesser known cooking instrument, the pressure cooker. He wants to fry the chicken in the pressure cooker, but soon recognizes you put hot oil into a pressure cooker, it can melt the O-rings, the rubber O-rings, and the things can explode. It can explode. Like it can become like a little bomb.
Whoa.
so he starts tinkering with this thing. He swaps out the rubber O-rings for metal ones, and adapting it so that he can put hot oil inside this pressure cooker and make it essentially a pressure fryer. And realizes he can now fry his chicken and have consistency where it's tender on the inside, crispy on the outside in just 8 minutes time.
Wow.
And so now you have, travelers can come through, they order up some chicken, in 8 minutes you can have chicken ready to go.
Yeah, and you don't have to always have it being cooked. So if somebody comes by at 1:00 in the morning and they want some fried chicken, you're like, I'll just throw it on right now. I'll be ready in 8 minutes, instead of like having to have it kind of prepared and try to keep it warm all day, all that stuff.
Exactly.
So how old is he at this point in the story?
So this is the 1930s. So he's about, he was born in 1890, so he's in his 40s. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm in my 40s now. I can't imagine tinkering with a pressure cooker, being like, let me put some oil on here and let's see if it explodes this time. But hey, more power to him,
Yeah, right.
He also experiments with the seasoning, and eventually through trial and error, he comes up with a patented blend of 11 herbs and spices, which becomes his secret recipe, which, to this day, Kentucky Fried Chicken is known for its 11 herbs and spices. Yes. And this is the time period that Sanders, established this.
He creates the secret recipe. And I have heard some like wild stories, and I don't know, I didn't verify any of this, but I've heard stories that like the secret recipe for original KFC fried chicken is like written on a piece of paper in a safe, in a vault, in a time lapse thing where two people have the combination, all this biometric stuff. Like you like Ocean's 11 kind of situation, a Mission Impossible to try to get the recipe.
Supposedly he only told his daughter the recipe, and he wrote it on a piece of paper and hid it in the door jamb of their house.
Oh.
I don't know. At some point I wonder Is this myth making? Is this real? Either way, it's a great story.
Right, but that was what you alluded to at the beginning of like, that's the power of this guy. That's one thing that makes him badass, right? Like beating up your clients as a lawyer and getting into gunfights is cool, but like another thing that he was awesome at that you said at the beginning was being an influencer, being a marketer. And, you know, when you say the 11 herbs and spices, like we know that because we've heard that on commercials all the time. This is a thing he came up with, and he created the myth that this is such a valuable recipe that, you know, it needs to be kept in a security like this, which whether it's true or not, that myth is the marketing, right?
It's brilliant. Yeah. And, you know, so in 1935, so he's now 45 years old, he receives a visit from, you know, his restaurant receives a visit from the governor of Kentucky at the time, Ruby Laffoon. And he tries Sanders' chicken, and he is blown away. And so much so that he names him a Kentucky colonel. He gives him the honorary title of Kentucky colonel. And now a Kentucky colonel, not a military rank. It is essentially he's granting him a spot in the Kentucky colonelcy, which is an organization established in 1813. And it's an honor bestowed to goodwill ambassadors of the Kentucky state, culture, folklore, traditions, and values. And so for Harlan Sanders, he recognizes this again as the perfect marketing tactic. No longer is he Harlan Sanders, he is now the colonel.
It's amazing.
And yeah, and from here on out, this is a new persona that he takes on. So not only does he have great chicken, but it's like a superhero origin story. You know, you talk about comics.
Yeah. So this is almost like the car ride with the Standard Oil guy, right? Where Governor Laffoon comes into the gas station in Hell's Half Mile, and Harlan Sanders is there, cooks him fried chicken that like he's never, like, blows him away on a degree that he's never had before. And then also, like, the guy's immediately just like, I'm gonna knight you in the Kentucky knighthood or whatever.
Exactly.
Rise, exactly. Colonel Harlan Sanders.
That's it. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And
pulls out a sword in the middle of the restaurant, like, I bestow upon you the title.
If only Los Angeles could do this for us, right? I mean, I suppose that's like winning an award. It's winning an Oscar or an Emmy or something. It's the equivalent of that.
The Emmys of food. I bet that probably exists somewhere, though. I mean,
it probably does. Yeah. Eater should really establish this if they haven't yet. So, you know, at this point, he's got this new persona. His restaurant is killing it. And he visits he has his next fortuitous meeting. He goes to a restaurant convention in Utah, and he meets another restaurant owner named Pete Harmon. And these two hit it off because they're both teetotalers. They don't drink, which, you imagine, like a restaurant convention, everybody's getting wasted. These are all anybody who's worked in the restaurant industry or, food and drink go hand in hand. And these two guys are,
the convention ends. Everybody goes into the bar. These two guys are the last two people standing in the convention area. Well, you want to get a coffee, I guess.
Exactly. So these two don't drink. They hit it off. Colonel Sanders is like, listen, you got to try my fried chicken. Pete Harmon tries it. He's like, this is amazing. You know, can you give me the recipe? Sanders is like, well, I don't just give out my recipe. It's proprietary. But here's what I can do. I'll give you the blend of spices. I'll show you how to use the pressure fryer, and I will let you sell my chicken recipe at your restaurant in Utah. The deal they make is Sanders will get 4 cents for every piece of chicken sold in Pete Harmon's restaurant. So he doesn't actually own any, piece of real estate there. It's just, he's essentially franchised the recipe to this restaurant in Utah.
It's interesting. It's like consignment almost. Like,
I'll
send you the stuff, you sell it, give me back a cut of my earnings.
Exactly. And it's, listen, I've got this great recipe.
And then he gets, in return, he gets 4 cents for every piece of chicken sold by Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Well, and it's not Kentucky Fried Chicken yet. It's just, it's Pete Harmon's restaurant in Utah. I don't remember the name of it. But supposedly Pete Harmon is the guy who coins the phrase, "It's finger licking good."
Oh, okay.
Which, good on Pete Harmon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this guy had it together. This guy knew a good thing when he saw it. Yeah,
good marketer as well. So 4 years later, now it's 1956. The Cold War is heating up, and Eisenhower passes the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. It authorizes $25 billion to build 41,000 miles of new interstate connecting the nation. Bad news is that it bypasses Colonel Sanders' gas station. So, he used to be on this small country road, and now it's bypassed by an interstate. And any of that car traffic that he was getting, those gas station attendees who, needed gas and wanted to eat some fried chicken, now they're no longer passing by his restaurant. And to the point where it really hurts his small business, and he's forced to close it down.
The Route 66 thing, or the plot of the movie Cars.
I haven't seen that one in a minute, but I
that's the plot. I have a 4-year-old now, so I'm well versed in the Cars cinematic universe. But yeah, I mean, that's not a huge surprise, right? I imagine that like I-75, they were like, should we run it through Hell's Quarter Mile? No, we should probably go around that. I'll probably go around. I'll go a little north of it.
They shoot ech other down there.
There's some crazy. There's fried chicken wars. That's fried chicken war country. You don't want to go down there.
So Colonel Sanders, he's not one to accept defeat easily. This is a guy who's hustled his whole life. It's 1956, so the guy's 66 years old at this point.
And this is just like yet another setback for him, right? Every time he starts 66. Like he's got it comes, something bad happens, and it's like, oh man, how many times do you have to keep knocking me down before? He never stays down. He keeps getting up.
Never stays down. And while some people, at the time might have retired at the age of 66, this guy's like, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep it going. I'm getting back up. So he decides to take his chicken recipe out on the road, partially inspired by the deal that he made with Pete Harmon to sell his chicken for, a nickel a piece of chicken at his restaurant. He goes around to restaurants all around the country doing something that he calls kerneling, which is he wears the suit, the gold-tipped cane, and he carries the pressure fryer, his chicken recipe, and he cooks his chicken for these people, does his little song and dance. My proprietary blend, 11 herbs and spices. They try the chicken, they love it, and he establishes these little franchises. Now, again, these are not brick and mortar places where he, is literally building a restaurant. These are pre-existing restaurants that are agreeing to sell Colonel Sanders' chicken recipe, and they'll give him 4 cents per piece of chicken sold.
So he's driving around in his car all around the country, and so he's just trying to get his chicken as a menu item on other restaurants' menus.
Exactly.
Wow. And just at 60 years old, sleeping in his car, driving around the country, traveling salesman in the 60s. And
he does the down home old Southern gentleman bit.
Shows up with the cane, and wouldn't it be funny? Like he goes home and he doesn't actually talk like that. He's like, "Ugh, hard day at job today, hard day at work today, man. I don't know."
And we know this is a guy who he was a fighter his whole life. He shot a guy. This is not like a sweet old man, but he has this persona of being this kindly Southern gentleman.
He's got his persona, and his character.
Shtick.
Yeah,
and he's very effective at it.
Absolutely.
So much so that he manages to strike deals with over 600 restaurants around the country. To sell his chicken recipe.
Wow.
And as a side note, one of these restaurants is located in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And there's a line cook working there who, he and Colonel Sanders hit it off. The guy is quoted apparently as having said, "I think that man's going to change my life." That line cook ends up managing 4 restaurants serving Kentucky Fried Chicken. He ultimately helps to establish like a uniformity of the recipe, simplifies the menu, policies that later get adopted by Kentucky Fried Chicken on the whole. But that line cook and later manager is Dave Thomas, who would later go on to found the Wendy's franchise.
Wow.
So Colonel Sanders actually like left a legacy beyond just Kentucky Fried Chicken, but the guy who goes on to not only found Wendy's, but also, go on to appear in all the commercials, and be a personality himself. He sort of takes a page out of Colonel Sanders' book in terms of, making yourself the personal brand for your restaurant chain.
Yeah, no kidding.
Pretty
That's
fascinating.
amazing. Yet they still pair up the KFCs with Taco Bells instead of Wendy's. That's weird.
How dare they?
I know, right?
These conglomerates. How dare they?
All right. Well, we should take a really quick break because we have one more ad break we got to get to. And then when we get back, so we're gonna get back into the story of Colonel Sanders. So stick right with us. All right, welcome back. I am here with Jason Cavanagh, and we are talking about Colonel Sanders. So he has now been driving around through just literally hard work and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles in his car. He has got KFC, or his secret recipe, fried chicken. The Colonel's fried chicken appears on menus in like 600 restaurants across the United States.
And I should note the name, and I sort of skipped this before, but the name Colonel Sanders Kentucky Fried Chicken is coined by Dave Harmon, who is the friend of his who he met in Utah and established the first essentially franchise of Kentucky Fried Chicken, where they were selling his recipe out of his restaurant. Pete Harmon put a sign out in front of his restaurant that said serving Colonel Sanders Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Which was kind of like exotic because he was in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've got like real down home cooking from Kentucky. Come here. Like, we're the only place in Salt Lake City where you can get authentic Kentucky food. Also
ironic that Harlan Sanders is actually born in Indiana on the Kentucky border, but
but not Kentucky.
could have been in Indiana Fried Chicken. Could have changed the course of history.
Or it might not have worked if you'd called it Indiana Fried Chicken. Nobody would have wanted it.
It doesn't. IFC. What would IFC channel be called? It would throw everything off. The butterfly effect would be enormous.
There's some alternate reality now. There's some multiverse where that's the case, and some Sliders episode.
Who knows? Anyway, in the early 1960s, Harlan Sanders is about 70 years old. He's doing really well. He's making about $300,000 a year on a nickel per piece of chicken at restaurants around the country. But again, he doesn't own any of these restaurants, and he doesn't really know how to grow the business any further. He's a small town guy. He doesn't have an MBA. He knows nothing about running a business, expanding a business. And so he decides to sell it to a Kentucky businessman named John Y. Brown and his partner, Robert Massey. Now, Sanders makes a deal for $2 million, which doesn't sound like a lot. It's the equivalent of $17 million today, and an annual salary of $40,000 a year, which doesn't sound great. But again, it's the early 1960s. This guy is 70 years old. He's probably thinking about how do I sort of not have to drive around the country franchising my product? How do I settle into this a little bit? Maybe look forward to retirement. A couple $1 million is a lot of money back then.
Yeah. This was back when that money went a lot farther than it does today too, right? And it's the most money he'd ever seen in his life, I imagine.
Exactly.
And so that seemed like a really good deal. And you don't have to drive around and ask restaurants if they want to carry your food anymore, right? You can quit that whole salesman part of it, which he must have kind of been getting tired of.
Well, the only catch is that he has to stay on as the brand spokesperson, and he signs away the rights to his likeness, so his name and his likeness. And there's no end date to the contract. So he's essentially signed away his own likeness and persona for the remainder of his life. At the time, he doesn't recognize this. It just seems like a good deal. I think his ego is like, great, I'm gonna, I'm the face of this thing. The businessmen will handle the business side of things. I could just, do some commercials. He actually starts doing TV and movie appearances to promote the brand. So sort of free advertising.
And there's the thing of like, I don't know, but nobody's going to steal my recipe, right? Like when the Colonel's secret recipe is up there, there's going to be a picture of my face, right? Because I made it.
And he still has some say in things. Brown and Massey established brick and mortar restaurants at this point around the country. So it's the first like Kentucky Fried Chicken branded restaurants where there's a uniformity to them. The facade, the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant facade that we now recognize, the bucket with his face on it. All those things become uniform. So they do expand the business in a way that makes sense. And in just 2 years, they're actually able to take the company public. And Sanders makes a pretty penny on the IPO.
Oh yeah.
Not something that he would have known the first thing about doing. He actually makes an appearance on the New York Stock Exchange floor and buys, I think, like the first 100 shares of the stock or something like that.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, it's a big thing for him. Like I said, he starts making TV and movie appearances. He's in a Jerry Lewis movie. He goes on the Tonight Show. He goes on the Merv Griffin show. And he's becoming a household name at this point. I think in his appearance on Merv Griffin, there's some quote that's like, a guy comes in and he's like, "I'm looking for the colonel that stole my wife." And then they cut to Colonel Sanders in the audience. This is bizarre late night television from a bygone era.
Yeah. You watch some of the, like, this guy was so hilarious. Then you go back and watch the old thing and you're like, I don't get it. I don't know if this is a reference to something that I'm not picking up, or if this was a play on words that then we don't have anymore, or if people just thought weird stuff was funny in the 60s, but it's not working for me.
Bizarre.
And now we're gonna parlay that into a 8-minute musical piece. Like, how long are we gonna watch this for?
So Sanders is, he's becoming a household name, and he actually starts appearing in TV commercials for Kentucky Fried Chicken as well. And he does the grandpa thing. He's essentially doing colonelling, but for a national audience, as opposed to just doing it for one restaurant owner saying, give me 5 cents for every piece of chicken you sell. Now it's, hey, come to Kentucky Fried Chicken and have a home cooked meal, and fast food is becoming more popular. So they're doing really well. By 1971, there's 3,500 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises, bringing in $700 million annually. And Brown and Massey, the guys who bought the company from Sanders, they get an offer from a food conglomerate called Hubline, which is like an alcohol conglomerate. Again, Colonel Sanders doesn't drink. Ironically, an alcohol conglomerate is buying his company, and they, Brown and Massey sell it to Hubline for $285 million,
Dang.
Which is the equivalent of $1.6 billion today.
Wow.
Now, you have to remember, just 10 years ago, Sanders sold the company to Brown and Massey for $2 million. Now they're selling it for $285 million. That
was a good
investment. Granted, they took it public. They established brick and mortar restaurants. They did things that he could not have done on his own. However, that has to sting a little bit to see, how much these guys were able to make. And he walked away with $2 million. And at this point, I think his annual salary had been up to $75,000. But
and then Brown goes on to be the governor of Kentucky, right? So that's like two governors that were in love with the Colonel's chicken.
Listen, fun fact: I once had lunch with the disgraced former governor of Kentucky.
Oh.
I was shooting a show down there. He had apparently had to resign because I think he was having an affair with his secretary. But we were shooting in this small town in Kentucky, and he asked to have lunch with us because, as Hollywood comes to Kentucky.
Awesome.
He's a nice guy, despite any of his transgressions.
Yeah.
Nice guy.
I mean, I think the Colonel might have had a couple of those transgressions too, from what I understand.
I imagine so. So so not only does Colonel Sanders now he sees like, oh wow, these businessmen.
But no, I think he did though. Wasn't his?
Money.
I think the colonel's second wife had been his mistress for a while.
I believe so, and I think
right?
she was someone maybe who worked for him.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Which, hey, the guy made his millions late in life, and
he's a likable guy. People like him.
People like him. He was charming. So to make matters worse, one of the things that Hubline, this corporation that bought Kentucky Fried Chicken, one of the first things they do is to cut costs. They change the recipes of the fried chicken and the sides. Now, we know that Colonel Sanders, he's always prided himself on the 11 herbs and spices, on the method for cooking this chicken. He literally drove around the country teaching people how to make this chicken. And now this alcohol company comes in and changes the recipe to save money.
This is the story that I heard. So the story I had heard, and I had heard it with Pepsi, but I think this is from this time period. But
Hubline owned it before Pepsi owned it. Yeah.
There was some story I had heard where they were at the way I heard the story, and like I said, this is one of these things that have probably become myth and legend at this point, but I'm pictured this big corporate office room where the guys come in their suits and they're sitting down, they're pitching the business practices, and the colonel's there in his white suit, and they're talking about how they're going to change the different things, and they're going to remove these sides, and they're going to standardize this, and they start talking about the gravy. And the story I heard is that he slams his hand down on the table and he stands up, and it's the first time he's talked all meeting, and he points his finger at the guy and he's like, "Don't fuck with my gravy."
I mean, he basically goes on a media offensive against his own company. He gives an interview to the New York Times, like chief food critic, and he says that Kentucky Fried Chicken's chicken is the worst fried chicken he's ever tasted. The gravy's like wallpaper paste, that it gags him, and it ain't fit for his dogs. This is a guy who's pissed off. He's like, he's his whole life has been dedicated to this chicken and this chicken recipe. And now that it's been bought, he kind of hasn't made off with a ton of money from this deal. And now they're changing his recipe, and they don't care. They're just trying to cut corners, and how can we save on costs so we can make this $285 million acquisition worthwhile,
Right. And so, there is I'm sure there was some component of him being like, I sold this thing for $2 million and then it got bought for $200 million. But, on the other hand, he has spent the last 30 years of his life perfecting this recipe and then selling it to people. Like, every person that bought Colonel Sanders' chicken or KFC, he sold it personally, right? They're using his face on the bucket, and he believes in, like, he must at some level, I know he's a salesman, at some level believe that this is the best fried chicken you've ever had in your entire life. And so he spent his entire life like attaching his name and likeness and personally guaranteeing the quality of this food by putting his own name on it. And then to have these other guys come in here in a scenario where he has no power over it, and they're like, yeah, we're going to keep the name, we're going to keep your face, but we're going to change it into something else. And he tries it, and he's like, this is not the thing that I had been promising people. Right? I imagine that sucks, but also
absolutely,
in some ways kind of good on, like, it's almost, I want to say it's almost like integrity for him to be like, no, this is not my chicken anymore. Like, I promised you one thing and this is not what you're getting anymore. Like, there is some kind of, because that must be, that's kind of the PR equivalent of punching your client in a courtroom, right?
Well, and he says that people come up to him on the street and they say, your chicken's changed. Like, I don't like it anymore. He is a celebrity at this point, and people recognize him as, the chicken is him. He is the equivalent of the chicken brand. And now that they're changing things, he feels he has a personal responsibility to his fans to maintain the recipe and the quality. And, he doesn't want to be a part of it if that's not the case. And so he actually announces that he is suing Kentucky Fried Chicken, the company that he himself founded and is the spokesperson for. He is suing them for $122 million. And not only that, he announces that he's opening a rival chicken restaurant, which he's calling the Colonel's Ladies Dinner House, named after his wife, Claudia.
The woman who had been his mistress, yeah.
I do want to say, I don't know that the Colonel's Ladies Dinner House has much of a ring to it. It's not quite the same as Kentucky Fried Chicken. But obviously, Hugh Blind takes issue with this because they say, I'm sorry, but we own your name and likeness. You cannot call a restaurant the Colonel's Ladies. It still has your name in it. You can't call it that. But they also recognize they have a massive PR disaster on their hands when the guy who is the founder, spokesperson for their brand is now suing them and opening a rival chicken restaurant.
There is a story like that in Seattle recently, like in the last decade or so. There was a fried chicken chain up here called Ezel's, which is awesome. Super, super good fried chicken. But there was some kind of ownership dispute. And Ezel, the guy who created the place, had to leave and create his own new fried chicken restaurant, but he did not retain the rights to the name Ezel's. So the Ezel's are still up, but somebody else runs them, and Ezel runs a different chain now. That's kind of what this sounds like a little bit.
Well, the steakhouse chain, Ruth's Chris.
Yeah.
Steakhouse. And it's such a bizarre, it's like Ruth's Chris. Like, what does that mean? But apparently it was a place called Chris Steakhouse, and then someone named Ruth bought it, but they wanted to keep the loyalty of the original customers, so they called it Ruth's Chris.
Huh. I've always been curious why there's an apostrophe in that name.
But it's just a bizarre thing. And it's like, when do you maintain sort of the name of something, but you want to branch off, whatever.
Yeah, it's wild.
At any rate, Hugh Blind, they see the PR disaster on their hands, and they recognize, you know what, we need to settle. We don't want this to go to a court. We don't want this to go to court. The press is bad enough already. And they managed to settle with Colonel Sanders for just $1 million. But they also make him the promise. And here's where I think his integrity comes into play. And it's not necessarily about the money. He settles for $1 million, but he wants to be able to come in and teach the executives the correct way to make his chicken and his gravy and potatoes and sides and all those things. And, they agree to do that. They're like, you know what, we're going to make sure we maintain your quality. We're going to use the quality ingredients. We're going to do things your way. Just please drop the lawsuit.
Please stop publicly embarrassing us.
please stop giving interviews to the New Yorker, and please change the name of the rival chicken restaurant. They don't tell him you can't open another restaurant, but they're like, change the name. So he actually changes it to the Claudia Sanders Dinner House.
Well, son, let me tell you what happened the last time I had a rival for my chicken.
That's true. They made off easy. They don't know how close a call that was.
But see, that is principle. It is about the chicken more than it's about the...
It was. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it was about the chicken recipe, and $1 million, it's something, but, and he's an old man at this point.
Mm-hmm.
This is late 70s. So he's in his 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And just a few years later, he passes away of pneumonia at the age of 90. But before he died, he managed to secure the legacy of KFC, corrected the changes to his recipe. And, despite having passed away, he's lived on, in our cultural imagination, and as the mascot. To this day, he's been portrayed by over 18 different actors and celebrities in commercials for KFC. It includes Daryl Hammond, Norm Macdonald, Jim Gaffigan, Rob Lowe, Ray Liotta, Reba McEntire, Jason Alexander,
the Mountain, didn't
Mario
the Mountain play
Lopez.
Didn't the guy who plays the Mountain on Game of Thrones portray him once? Like
maybe. And my favorite, RoboCop.
Yes.
So, if you got RoboCop
mm-hmm.
posing as you're iconic. You have that little goatee and the tie. I mean, it's it. Today, KFC's valued at $5.43 billion, exists in over 125 countries around the world, which is, an amazing leap from a gas station in Hell's Half Acre.
Right.
So,
yeah,
pretty good.
I spent 2 months in China, and I was traveling around there, and like, they have American fast food restaurants there, but the one that is like They're like, oh, KFC. Anytime you talk about American food, that's like what they say. Oh, KFC, that's the biggest one in China. They love it there more than McDonald's, more than Wendy's, any of that other stuff.
Amazing.
Because at first I was like, KFC, that's the one that's like your favorite. And then, but it was across the board.
I mean, it's delicious. I read that in Japan for Christmas, there's like huge lines for KFC because it's like the thing that they eat as like, it's a comfort food.
Well, they have Japanese professional baseball has the curse of Colonel Sanders. Have you heard of this? So there's a Japanese pro baseball team called the Hanshin Tigers, and they won some game in 1985, and they had this huge, basically like party after the game, after they'd won this important baseball game, and somebody pulled down a statue. They had a statue of Colonel Sanders in Hanshin at the time, I guess, and somebody pulled it down and threw it into the river, and they decided that that was like the curse, and then they sucked after that, and they lost all the time, and they were like, that was the curse, was like they'll never win again until this curse has been, like they're like, the ghost of Colonel Sanders is haunting us. We did something terrible, and now we have to live it down. And they eventually pulled it out of the river and cleaned it up and restored it, and then they won the championship in 2023. So
that's incredible. I hope that we can, in lauding this great man, that we can reap some of the benefits of luck and good fortune.
Yes.
In our own lives. And, but he's such a testament to the fact that, like, don't give up.
Yes.
You can have a late in life, you can make your millions. He's a badass.
Yeah, and that's kind of the takeaway. Like, so one thing when we talk about badass, when I've been doing the show for a while, and I've been writing about this stuff for a couple decades now, and the kind of defining characteristic of a badass is not necessarily shooting your rivals as much as it is like, a determination to accomplish a goal, and an unwillingness to be stymied by obstacles that get in your way, failures, insurmountable odds. Whenever the world puts up against you, you persevere and you don't give up until you've accomplished whatever it was you were trying to accomplish. And I mean, that's this story. This guy had 100 jobs. He didn't make his recipe until he was like 50 or so. And then after that, he's driving all around the country as an older man to try to sell this thing until he becomes a household name to the place where they're building statues to him in Japan, and Norm Macdonald is playing him on TV. And, to this day, he's a recognizable figure, like he's been dead for decades now, and you still can hear his voice, right? When you think about him, which is just unbelievable. And that kind of really is a testament to what he was able to accomplish and his unwillingness to give up. And even now, like, he had done a lot of charitable giving with his money. He had made a bunch of money, obviously, over his career, but he used it to build a lot of children's hospitals. That was a thing that him and his wife were really into. And so they either restored or built several children's hospitals around the country and in Canada. And so those are still around. And that's another testament to this guy, like, working hard. He wanted to make money because he never had any, but once he got it, it was never really about that. It was about, kind of finding success finally after struggling for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that he inspired, I still think it's so crazy that Dave Thomas sort of got his start working for Colonel Sanders and learned those things from. It's a fascinating character. And, it's so interesting when you learn about history and you see these paths crossing and you go, oh, wow, that's how that person got there. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of. And then everybody afterwards, right? Because most fast foods have a mascot now. It might not be the founder of the place. Like, they didn't do it with Ray Kroc, but they created Ronald McDonald, so, it's a thing you see when you talk about influencers and stuff too, where you create this persona and you use it, and it's your public persona that you use to promote this product. And, he kind of sets the stage for a lot of that.
100%, right? The importance of brand. Is he understood that before we even we're using terminology like that, which I think
Yeah.
is
And
pretty
maintaining the
fascinating.
quality of the brand. Like when he thought it was going down, like he fought really hard to bring it back up, which is pretty
Mm-hmm.
cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for being on the show and for bringing an unexpected badass to Badass of the Week, because I was very happy. I really enjoyed going through this with you, and really am glad that you took your time out to come and talk to us. So thank you for
Yeah,
being
it's been
here.
a pleasure. Thank you so much.
What are you working on now? Where can people find more of your stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I have a doc project in the works. I've got a movie podcast in early development. You can find my podcast, Son of a Hitman, is on Spotify and Apple. True crime podcast about Charles Harrelson, father to the actor Woody Harrelson, who was convicted for the assassination of a federal judge, claimed to have been involved in the JFK assassination. That one's a fun listen. If you want to watch the episode on Colonel Sanders, The Food That Built America, The Colonel, I believe it's a History Channel show. I believe you could watch it on Hulu. I also did an episode on Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, an Apple versus Microsoft episode. I did one on the history of orange juice, which was pretty fascinating. Yeah, some fun stuff. Check that stuff out, and look out for upcoming projects.
All right,
as they develop.
Sounds great. All right, Jason, thank you so much for being on the show, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. We always appreciate having you here, and please stick with us. Next week, we'll be back to you with another badass. So stay badass. Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.